Okay, we are ready to get started. Thanks for everybody attending this important seminar. It is my pleasure today to be the moderator and host the R15 training seminar. And we have four distinguished researchers that will be presenting and be part of the panel to answer questions. This is a series of training modules that the Molecular Cell Biology Core of the IMBRE program grant will be putting together to train our investigators not only in the R15 that we're facing today, but also perhaps for R21 and R1 mechanisms in the future. So today we're all honored to have four distinguished guests. Dr. Samithamby Jeyaseelan will be our lead speaker. Dr. J, as we call him at the LSU Vet School. He's an associate professor in the Department of Pathobiological Sciences. He is currently funded with a R1 from Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. He's also multiply funded by other mechanisms from other agencies, and he has a very robust research program in the respiratory immunopathogenesis of bacterial diseases. Jay also has served as in the editorial board of Journal of Immunology. He's a current participant in the editorial board of PLOS ONE and other important journals. More importantly for us, Jay has reviewed recently not only R1s but also R15, specifically grants. And he has direct contact with program officers that have actually taught him and shared with him slides and information about the R15 program. And Jay will be our first speaker. We will follow up with Dr. Andrew Yurochko that will make some comments following immediately Dr. Jay. Dr. Yurochko is a professor, Department of Microbiology at the LSU Science Center. He's a current member of the Virology A study section of the NIH. And he also has reviewed all types of grants, including R15. So he'll give us his take on this. Immediately after that, the third speaker would be Dr. Chris Gissendanner. And Chris is at the University of Louisiana Monroe. He's a recipient of an R15 grant. He's actually going into competitive renewal right now. And he'll share with us his experience with this particular effort. And our last speaker will be Dr. Shisheng Li, who is an associate professor at the LSU Vet School, the Department of Comparative Biomedical Sciences. And Dr. Shisheng Li has been funded in the past with a number of different grants. He has a robust research program, but even more importantly for us today, he has recently received an R15 grant award that just started. So without having further ado, Dr. J, it's all yours.
It's on.
Okay. Thanks, Gus, for introducing all of the speakers and moderating the session. And I'm going to lead this basically the discussion. First of all, I would like to thank you guys for showing up for this R15 seminar series. And I will present with some slides and will give you some ideas about the R15 mechanism, and we will all move afterwards. And most importantly, we would like to hear your input, or if you have any questions or comments regarding the grant mechanisms, please feel free to ask us now, or you can email, or you can call, or whatever you wish to do. Okay, without further ado, I would like to show you some slides. So basically, we will talk some of the essentials or the important aspects of R15. So you know that these all R15 grants are funded by the NIH, and these all grants needs to go through the peer review process. And as we know that this NIH is not a single institute, and basically NIH has 27 institutes as well as centers, and some of them are basically only fund extramural grants, But most of them, or most of the institutes and the centers, they have their own labs or intramural funding. As at the same time, they fund people like us to get our research extramurally done in different universities as well as in centers. So as we know that we all are well aware about some of the grant mechanisms uh, from the NIH. So we call them as some of them are R grants, so including research grants and small research grants, area grants, R21s, exploratory grants, as well as some of the SBIR or SBTR type of grants. At the same time, there are some other mechanisms, we call them as P grants. These are basically much bigger grants with a lot of money, and they funded several multi-PI program projects. At the same time, they also fund several center grants. So for example, we have one center in New Orleans, the Alcohol Center, which is run by the Dean Steve Nelson. This is one of the center grants funded by the National Institute of Alcohol and Drug Abuse. At the same time, the NIH also funds several training grants or mechanisms. We call them as T32s. So these are basically not the individual grants. So the NIH gives these grants to the institutions so they can fund the meritorious grants in those institutes. And also we have some of the T35 mechanisms. We have one of such grants we have in the Baton Rouge between the vet school as well as the Tulane Primate Center. And this grant is mainly funds the investigators who have a DVM degree. At the same time, they are interested in doing anatomic pathology or clinical pathology residency program, whether in the vet school or in the Tulane Primate Center. At the same time, we have several fellowships. We call them as individual fellowships. You can definitely apply as an individual. So at least they have three mechanisms. One of them is called the F30. So basically the F30 grants, they fund MD/PhD or the dual degree students who are applying for their pre-doctoral fellowship. In other words, you know that I think if you get into the MD PhD program in a medical school, which is about 7 years, so you have to finish the first 2 years preclinical studies, then you go to a lab and get to do your PhD for the subsequent 3 years. Then afterwards, you go back to the medical school to finish your clinical programs. So basically, these MD PhD degrees are 7 year in duration. In other words, it's a little bit longer. That is pretty standard in the different medical schools in the United States. And also we have some of the F31 mechanisms. So these are kind of a unique, we call them as diversity or diversity type of pre-doctoral fellowships. For example, this is especially meant for people who are kind of a minorities, such as Hispanic Americans or African Americans or some Vietnamese people, and so other categories which are defined by the NIH. Because the other aspect of the NIH is to increase diversity, especially in clinical programs, because we would like to have scientists or clinicians to treat or see who can see their community. So that will really would be helpful. So in order to improve the diversity programs, especially for the pre-doctoral fellowships, this is the appropriate mechanism to obtain a fellowship from the NIH. At the same time, we have F32s. So these are pretty standard postdoctoral fellowships. And at the same time, because as you have seen in the past several years, getting grants can, every year can become a nightmare. In other words, the getting grants are getting much more difficult in each and every year because of the current budget climate. So because of that, the age of the people who can get the first grants went really, really up. So in order to reduce the minimum age of the people who can get their first grants, So the NIH has recently introduced a program called Kangaroo Award. It's like the animal kangaroo. So it begins with the K99, we call them as the K, and ends up with the ROO, we call them as RU. That's why we call them as a Kangaroo Award. So this is the other name for this award is called the Pathways of Independence Award. So this award is basically 5 years in duration, and the first 2 years you have to work with a mentor, and the subsequent 3 years you have kind of an independent funding to establish your lab. So the advantage of getting this award is that you can still be an early stage investigator, although this, this award will not discount you to go to get an NIH grant as an early stage investigator, and we will talk about that in a minute. At the same time, we have other type of career development awards such as KO8 or K08. So this is basically Mentored Clinical Scientist Development Award. And this award is unique because only the MDs as well as dentists as well as DVMs only can apply to this unique grant mechanism. At the same time, there are some PhDs who have substantial training, so by seeing patients or by working with the clinical people, they also can apply to this KO8 award under special circumstances. At the same time, we have the K-12 award. This is really rare because we call them as institutional career development programs. So in other words, what I have shown you in this list is that you have seen a variety of training grant mechanisms are available at the NIH for you to apply. So, but the caveat or the limitation is that although there are many mechanisms, as I mentioned to you, but not all of the mechanisms are available at all institutes or all centers under all circumstances, as we all are well aware. So now we will switch gears a little bit from the broader aspect to narrow down our focus on these area grants or R15s. We also call them as NIH Academic Research Enhancement Awards. So what are R15s? So basically these R15s are basically congressionally appropriated money. Basically, we know that in each and every institution in the United States does not have the right facility or the resources to become competitive nationally in order to get big grants such as NIH. In other words, because if this program is not in place, what will happen is this is a cause, but the effect is going to be those smaller institutions would not be able to train undergraduates as well as the graduate students. So this was a big concern for numerous decades in the United States. So that's why the Congress people under the president, so they have enacted a law in 1985 to make this program, to initiate this program in place so that smaller institutions, so they can at least get this mechanism to get some money or some funds so that they can establish their infrastructure facilities. At the same time, they can train undergraduates. At the same time, they can place themselves in a much better position in order to get nationally competitive grants. So that is the basic idea of this initiation in 1985. So what are these area grants? So what would these grants do? So we have at least 3 goals of those area grants. So the first goal, we should not forget that it is important to support this really good research or meritorious research. So that is in a nutshell. And several people, it's a wrong concept that they think that when you apply for an R15, on the next day or after your review process is done, you would be able to get funded. It is a myth or it's a false concept. But I think what like an R01 or the other mechanisms, this your R15 grants also should should propose a meritorious research or pretty good research. In other words, your hypothesis and the specific aims should be solid in order for a grant to be funded even through the R15 mechanism. So in other words, your science is a must. So then what happens is, I think the idea, the second goal of this program is to strengthen the research environment in different institutions which are, in generally speaking, are much smaller. In other words, they don't get a lot of NIH money to improve their resources as well as the diversity or the diversity of undergraduates. The third goal is to expose students to research, because if you look at the United States, we have different, from north to east as well as west to south, we have different institutions. Not every institution is up to the same standard. So we need to bring those undergraduate students in smaller universities. So in other words, they will have some sort of skills sets, so they will be able to go to different universities and improve their skills. So in other words, the people who have really, really great the potential, technical potential should not be, repressed. In other words, we need to encourage them to go through the training in our institutions so that, they will be successful in their careers. So that is the idea. So in other words, this program R15, although it is small, have at least three goals as I mentioned to you now. So then I think what will happen is, I think then we will talk about what kinds of studies these area grants or the R15s will support. So in other words, these grants are only up to 3 years. In other words, these grants are shorter in duration in general. But at the same time, the money is a maximum of $300,000. So in other words, you cannot do too much. At the same time, if you are lucky, if you would be able to do something, definitely you would be able to accomplish substantially. So the R15 grants can support some of the pilot or small scale studies or feasibility studies. At the same time, you can propose something for, to develop some new drugs or to develop a new technique or to develop a new mechanism to analyze, or you can even suggest something. You are going to do the human genome or something which are already available, so that you can use that database to come out with something which could be meaningful down the road. That's what it is. We are talking about, that it's a secondary analysis of available data sets. At the same time, you can it does not disqualify you to propose your own research ideas. So in other words, you can definitely propose your novel or new research ideas through this mechanism as well. But there's just one limitation. So you can have only one area grant at a single time. There shouldn't be any overlap. In other words, you should apply when you get your grant. After you get your grant, you have to apply on the third year. But these R15 grants can be renewed throughout. So in other words, when we review grants, so like as mentioned in the earlier, so I was reviewing these grants for the 2+ years, and we have seen several good applications, uh, from different universities. So what are those, the essentials of these area grants? So your introduction is usually 1 page. This is only would be applicable when you revise or the resubmit your application. But other words, your specific aims, that's pretty standard to many of those R type of grants, which is a single page. At the same time, your research strategy is kind of a long, so it's like an RO type of a grant. So that is basically 12 pages. So which includes your background, definitely your significance, your innovation, as well as your approach. Approach is a critical part of many grants because many of the grants can be dinged, including R15s, R01s or R21s can be dinged in the approach section much harsher or harder than many other sections. Because your approach should be, you have to show the feasibility. In other words, you have to show at least some preliminary, solid preliminary data that your proposal can be done successfully. At the same time, nowadays, you may need to show that at least some of your proposed experiments can, if potentially, break the ground down the road. At the same time, the approach also should include the progress report if it is kind of a resubmission grants. And as we know that in all of the approach section, that is little really harsh, hard section to write. At the same time, you can use tables, you can use graphs, you can show pictures, you can use diagrams, charts, and whatever you want to do. But at the same time, everything should be in those 12 pages. In other words, people have evolved, including all of us, in such a way to write nicer grants with limited spaces. So how much the R15 will provide? This is basically a total of $300,000 up to 3 years. So this is the maximum money, and that's the max. And this is, you can use this money up to 3 years. So the total duration is up to 3 years. But if you want to go beyond 3 years, there are a couple of options you can do for if you have some saved money. So you can do that as a carryover for the next 1 or 2 years. The other option is that you can again submit for a new R15 grant. So what are those eligible institutions? Of course, the LSU is eligible. I think the biological sciences is eligible, and the vet school and many other, small institutions are kind of eligible. Why we call them as small institutions? They are not really small, but they don't bring more than $6 million per year from the NIH based on the statistics for in the last 7 years. In other words, if you get more than $6 million per year or more for the last 4 years out of last 7 years, you may not be eligible. So if you get to $6 million or less for per year for the last 4 years out of those 7 years, you are definitely eligible. In other words, I think many of the institutions in Louisiana, except the medical schools, are kind of eligible. So what are the requirements being an individual to apply to this grant mechanism? So as we know, like always NIH says, any individual, anyone can write the grant. But I think, but there are some limitations to R15s, because if you have already a grant, even an R03, R21, R01 or any type of a grant, and in which if you are a principal investigator or PI, then you will not be able to apply to these R15s. So in other words, R15 should be your first grant. Afterwards, you can apply to any number of grants, but not the other way around. And at the same time, I mentioned to you about that, I think you can have only one active R15 grant at a time. And also, as we know that nowadays, a lot of people who do apply multiple grants, but if you get one grant, especially one area OR15 grant, and you have to live with it for at the next 3 years, but you would not be able to get another R15 grant. I think that will be clear. So now we will move to some investigator business a little bit. So as you know that new investigators versus ESIs or early stage investigators, and NIH would like to give a break in many institutes to new investigators as well as to early stage investigators. But some of the institutes like heart and lung, they don't give any break in terms of pay lines to new investigators, but at the same time, they will give a big break to early stage investigators. So it all depends on the institute and their program and their programs. So as we know that new investigators, because if you are a new investigator means you didn't get any substantial grant from the NIH. But on the other hand, if you are an early stage investigator or ESI, that means you are within the 10 years after obtaining your PhD degree, or for MDs, we don't usually look at the years when they got their MDs, but we will look at that the years, 10 years after completing their residency. That's the way we will evaluate them. But for PhDs, since they don't have their residency program, so I think it should be within 10 years after obtaining their PhD. So that is the definition of the early stage investigators versus new investigator. In other words, NIH basically promotes, NIH encourages early stage to people to get grants when they are early stage investigators. So then what are the deadlines of those area grants? So these area grants have different deadlines than the real R01 grants. So I think usually they are about 15 to 20 days after the R01 deadline. So that is February 25th, June 25th as well as October 25th. And also when we review that, we review them later in March as well as July and November. So if you would like to get more information about this NIH grant, I think there's a nice website on the nice NIH website you could definitely visit at any time. So this will give you your contact information and other important aspects of the area grants from the NIH. And these are some of the names of the people from the NIHS. And if you have any questions or comments, it's important for everyone to call the program officers and ask about the situations. And if you have any questions, you can clarify that your issues before applying for any grants, including R15s. So how do we review those R15s? I think the review process is really tough. And also, but if you look at the NIAID websites over the several years, I think the number of area grants or R15s got funded are kind of a plateau or the same, but they have increased the money. So initially it was about $75,000. Afterwards it was $150,000. Now it is about $300,000 because this is a congressionally appropriated money. It should be given in each year. So as we know that, I think the essentials in a review, what we are looking for is that basically for including R01s for any NIH grants, so your work should be significant. The significance will definitely carry a value. In other words, whether your work will have a substantial advance down the road in the field. In some people, some reviewers state that whether your work is kind of a groundbreaking. So these are extremely important aspects, the significance. We may have a lot of millions of ideas, and if we don't come out with a significant problem in terms of human health or in terms of mechanisms or public health, it may be extremely difficult for that grant by the reviewer to get a kind of a very high score to be funded. And also the investigator is also important. Investigators nowadays, it can be one investigator or it can be more than one. We call them as multiple principal investigators or MPI programs. So nowadays, I think if you have some other well-established investigators, it is not a bad idea to hook them up. So at least 2 or 3 investigators will definitely strengthen your application. At the same time, the innovation, how do we define innovation? A lot of people are confused still I think that is the fact. The innovation can be two important ways. The first way is that your conceptual innovation, whether your idea is novel, and I think it is really a brand new idea to propose, we call them as a conceptual innovation. At the same time, we call the group 2 as technical innovation. So in other words, what they are looking for in this group is that whether you have any unique tools to apply to solve the problem you have hypothesized or you have proposed. So the innovation can be both, but conceptually as well as technically. If you come out with really good ideas using really novel tools, that will really help for the reviewers to give a good score. And approach, we talked about that quite a bit about the approach. This is really a tricky section, and you don't have a lot of space because of the page limits. But I think in this one, you have to definitely give a proper hypothesis, and also your specific aims, and within the specific aims, you have to provide a really good rationale why you are proposing those specific aims. At the same time, you have to show what kinds of tools you would be able to use in order to address your proposal much more successfully. At the same time, a lot of people, I think they are really confused about the environment, including the people who are in Louisiana. I think they all are running here and there to see, oh my gosh, I live in Louisiana, I get 4, 5, 6, 7 and very bad scores, probably they will kill me because of the environment. So I think environment is definitely one of the critical factors, because the NIH and the reviewers would like to know whether you are in the right environment, although you propose novel ideas, whether you would be able to accomplish. In other words, if you don't have the proper environment, as we know that, it may be very hard. That is where the collaboration will come to play. In other words, in order to make your environment much more stronger, you may need to collaborate with other institutes, or in your same institute where people have really good expertise in the area you are proposing. So these are kind of 5, we call them as inflammation. You all know that this inflammation is what is that? It's a host response to infection or non-infectious in nature. So we call them as there are 5 cardinal signs of inflammation. So like that, for a grant, we have 5 important signs of what is that? Successes. So one is significance, investigator, innovation, approach, and environment. If any of these groups is not going to be good, I think the grant will be most likely will be dinged. So we have to try our best to address these old issues really good. So how do you may know the new criteria, how we all score those grants nowadays. I think because we score those grants based on the impact. So we group them into 3 groups. One type is high impact. So that we give them a score of 1, 2, and 3. And with a moderate impact, so we will go from 4, 5, and 6. And then we will go to the grants with low impact. That should be 7, 8, and 9. Nowadays, NIH has changed. This is for we call them as the overall impact score. So if you look at the overall impact score, 1 we call them as exceptional. So I don't know, how do you define exceptional? So my definition, and many other people, we all have defined that this grant should not have even a single major weakness. In other words, this is a perfect grant. So I think number 2 is outstanding. That means this is a good grant or outstanding grant with a few minor weaknesses. Even number 3, this is an excellent, this is also a solid grant, but with a few minor kind of a weaknesses. So if you look at these high impact, that means the weaknesses are going to be minor. Nothing is major. If anything is a major weakness, then it goes to the group 2, or moderate impact or low impact. And I think if for a grant nowadays to get funded, you have to be in the very high impact site. It's very, very, very extremely important. And now we have another system, even for R15s, for the grant, half of the grants basically we triage them. So in that one, so you have to, any scores below 4 will be triaged, will be unscored or not discussed. So that is the right now the situation. These are the strengths, these are the weaknesses. This is showing the scores in a nice graphical mode. So that's all I would like to say to you guys today. And I think if you have any questions, and you can feel free to ask. And I'm certain that the other speakers are going to give you much more insights about those R15 grants. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jay. Yurochko, Andrew, are you on the phone still?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Andrew, it's your, I'll yield the floor to you for your comments in general. Anything you would like to say?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Okay, good. So I reviewed, obviously I'm a standing member of Virology A, and we've reviewed R15 grants, which Jay talked a lot about. So R15s, as you heard, are a really nice mechanism for arguably smaller institutes, although I think it's more of dollar amounts than size, of course. Under 5 or 6 million, you have to make sure you qualify. They are small grants, but they are looking for good science, and they're looking for science that can be done at, again, quote, a small institute. So a number of ones that I've seen funded and ones I've reviewed are at institutes where are generally perhaps not even PhD students are available, so masters and undergraduates. And you have to propose your application for the quality of the student you have. With that stated, it still has to be quality work. The applicant is judged, the work is judged, etc. But they do look at where you are, who you are, and what you can get accomplished within that context. And I've seen this as an excellent mechanism. $100,000, you get all the money up front in 1 year. It's a great mechanism to teach students. It's fantastic for the universities. There's a section on impact the universities, section on impact for teaching. And again, I think it's an excellent mechanism. It is not a training grant per se, but I've seen a lot of grants go down not only for the science, but for not addressing a critical component being how does it impact the university. I think some people, arguably at least, again, from what it just looking at a grant, perhaps they think of it as a mini R21 or a mini R01, or but it's really not. It is a different small project grant in the R03, R15 vein. These are smaller grants, and they do want you to make comments, a significant point in how this impacts university, how it impacts teaching, bringing undergraduates in. I've seen a number at nearby institutes that have got it that are really primarily undergraduates, and they have commented that, X number of students have rotated through the lab, whether it be undergraduates or master's students. And I think this is an important point, although, again, not a training grant per se, where it's not an absolute number, but it is nevertheless an important point. So I think in a big picture sense, that's your R15. Like I said, I think Louisiana should qualify in a number of the institutes. We're going to hear a little bit later today from University of Louisiana Monroe, which I think is a perfect institute. I hate to use smaller because it's not the accurate term, but it is used at NIH to indicate universities that are generally not, say, at the med schools or these larger ones, say, UNC and UAB, or Texas Southwestern, that obviously have tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars in grant funding. Like I said, these are excellent mechanisms, and I certainly encourage everyone who qualifies for these, if you can put together an application. It is a great way to get the lab started, to get the university started on research. It is, like I said, an application based on merit of science as well as merit of impact to the university with interest in teaching and undergraduates. in that sense. Jay mentioned about getting these grants renewed. As far as I know, you can get them renewed as long as you keep doing the work. I have seen and reviewed many that have come in for renewal after 3 years, which, as we've already heard, is the length of time, although certainly you could do a no-cost extension if you want to go a little bit longer. But assuming you have completed your grant and you're going to submit it for renewal, the same criteria will be judged: merit of the award, merit of the science, as well as impact. Certainly, because it is going in as a renewal, they were going to ask you in more detail how many students perhaps rotated. Again, it's not an absolute number, it's good or bad, but they want to see you make note of the impact that this has had. And one I reviewed recently, someone had noted that 20-some undergraduates had rotated through the lab and spent a month or two, the summers, working in the lab. And I thought, to me, I found that exceptional, as did the other reviewers under that criteria. They certainly judge you on papers, and I want to emphasize this because I unfortunately saw one that I thought was an excellent grant, but they didn't publish in the 3 years, go down because of lack of publication. In essence, a judgment of success, even though, these are small grant at an institute that, a faculty member worked 9 months, basically, I guess 100% on university related, and really only had summers to do work, but nevertheless the impact was judged that nothing got accomplished. Now that investigator did publish in the next resubmission, and I think got a much more favorable review. And because these are smaller grants, 100,000, institutes that may not even have PhD students, although having PhD students does not in any way preclude you from getting this award, as long as your institute, university, or however the university is broken down, gets less than $6 million a year, or has $6 million, I think it's total, but you can look that up. As long as you have less than that, you can qualify. So again, you by in general nature are not going to have the same level that you may have in R01, but getting a paper out, regardless of whether it's in what may be where you came from as a top tier journal you're used to, go for lower, I won't say lower impact, because it's not fair to say this isn't quality work, because it very much is, but appreciate that you may only have $100,000 a year. That probably goes for summer salary for some of the faculty that I've seen that do not get paid in the summer. They don't have graduate student stipends for teaching, so you can see how money can get used up quite quickly, and you may only have undergraduates. So nevertheless, work on getting papers out. This is something that they do criticize, or at least in the renewals. It's a point that they focus on, at least again in my experience, quite heavily. I think in a big picture sense, that's sort of my views of the application, how it's reviewed, at least at a virology study section, NIAID. About renewals, some of the key points that I've seen focused on for the last 2 years on this. I will make one additional point, at least for virology, and I believe it might be for many elements of NIAID. They're taking unfortunately, because I enjoyed reviewing them, it was sort of a nice break of seeing, I think, a more true type of science than the R01s, in the context that was involved with teaching and growth of the university and growth of students, as opposed to R01s. I enjoyed reviewing these, but they're, at least for now, whether it's an NIAID experiment for one cycle, multiple cycles, I don't have that information. But we are not going to review R15s. I just got my group of grants to review for the June study section, and there's no R15s in there, at least none that I got. And I'm from the SRO, they're going to be reviewed across a board in a different study section, with all, from my understanding, R15s being covered in a single study section, at least with pathogens. So I don't know how that'll impact, for better or for worse, funding, but apparently it is what it is. I'll stop there, and if anyone has any questions, I'll gladly spend more time on at least R15 certainly I've reviewed R01s, R03s, R21s, and if people have questions, certainly for Jay or I on other aspects of that, I'm all ears for the next 10 or so minutes before I have to run off to my biosafety meeting.
Okay, thanks a lot, Andrew, for your input and sharing with us your valuable time. I understand you're very busy up there in Shreveport. I would actually, at this point, maybe since Dr. Yurochko will have to leave in about 15 minutes, I would open the floor for a few questions to him directly, and then we'll continue with the program with the other two speakers. Anybody has any burning question for Dr. Yurochko? There's a question
from LSU Shreveport.
You're too loud.
Too loud? Sorry.
That's better.
Okay. I have a question about eligibility. If I apply for if I apply for R15 grant as a PI, but I want to bring something in, let's say from the Health Science Center, is that allowed? Because
could you speak up? I think maybe you went down too much. I didn't quite hear everything.
Okay, so let's say I want to apply for R15 grant as a PI. Can I bring someone in from LSU Health Science Center as either as a co-PI or as a collaborator?
I think as a collaborator, co-PI, I think we had this problem, this issue before, and I think you need to be very careful if they are a collaborator or a co-PI, because if they're an institute that has more than the minimum, the 5 or 6 million, I think that will disqualify the entire application. Now, whether you can ask them as a consultant, that I don't see why you can't, but I would certainly check with the SRO for that purpose. Certainly they can give you reagents, they can give you tools, and a consultant, which in theory has no salary support and only has just, phone, email conversations, to my recollection, that's not a problem. But I know in regards to an actual collaboration, what they don't want, for instance, is here at our Health Science Center, me collaborating with, say, University of Louisiana Monroe, and essentially getting around the rule of the 6 million by splitting some money with a colleague at a university that does qualify while we do not. So my experience is be careful with that. Ask your SRO that question directly and find out the rule. And my impression is just from, I think, the discussions during study section, and I will admit that I don't have that sheet directly in front of me, but as I recall, that is a problem with the collaboration.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? Any other question right now?
I have a question. Will you be able to hear me if I
Yes, I think so.
Okay, so the word I hear out on the street with regard to the R15 is that the funding rate is pretty low. And with that in mind, what are a couple of things that characteristically kill R15 proposals, in your opinion?
In a big picture sense, it's many of the same things that have killed an R01. As far as, if you think of the investigator, if they haven't published, that's the problem. Now, with that stated, they clearly know that you're at a smaller institute, and so I will say that at least when I reviewed it, I didn't hold them the same standard as if someone was from Harvard, because I believe that's unfair. You have to meet the criteria of the university you're at, but nevertheless, you don't want to have a whole 3, 4, 5 years. I think that would be a problem. From a standpoint of science, again, it has to be hypothesis-driven, major, that idea of the scientific method of a hypothesis-driven, testable hypothesis. That I've seen a lot. I don't know why it's more in R15s. I don't know if it's just thought there's a small grant. We got some exciting ideas and went with it. They're just newer faculty, maybe lacked mentoring, and so I think in many cases the mistakes that I have seen personally were mostly grantsmanship issues likely because people went to institutes where they didn't have mentors that say, here's my grant, and can you read it? And honest impression of what this would take to be a solid application. Again, with that stated, you want obviously hypothesis-driven, testable hypothesis or experiments testing hypotheses. I have seen some really overly ambitious that arguably could not be done at the university. Please make sure you can get your work done at the university that you're at. If you don't have an EM, don't propose experiments like that are not feasible at the university you're at. That's just one example. And I think other points. I know not addressing, even though it's not a traditional training grant, a complete lack of attention to the elements of what make the R15, I think, exciting. The training environment for students, again, not a training grant, but pointing out how this is going to impact the university, how undergraduates are going to benefit, how a unique feature of university. I read one from a women's university. They played that up, and it was a fantastic application about showing before and after the R15 how many more women got in science, for example. Obviously, minorities. This is not an absolute, but these are just some points that I thought really stood out in my mind in this. Others I've seen that maybe haven't had women or minorities, but have really played up the idea at that university that 1% of students graduated, went on to science from their lab. They had 10 students spend time in the lab, and 40% of them applied to a graduate program, for example. And that, those are incredible statistics. I know a small number of 10, 4 went on versus, arguably in the general population less than 1. But these are things that, influence a reviewer's impression that you really are making some progress. And then again, like I said, at least on a resubmission publishing, whether it is in for me, virology, if you published in virus research or archives virology, I think they'd be happy that you got a paper published. In fact, a comment, not from me, but another reviewer on one that was a resubmission said, I would have been happy with a publication anywhere, including a newspaper. I just wanted to see something published that they were getting things out. And so again, this is just my impression, but these are some of the key points that I've seen that I think have really impacted in the context of it, when answered correctly, have made for a very meritorious score, and at least I know at least one application that I know of, because a colleague called me up and asked me to go to visit them. I don't know if it was to say anything or not, but I know they got an R15 funded. It was prior to my time on study section, but nevertheless, I know that R15, they wanted to know more about it since I'm now on there and how to get it renewed and stuff. So I know they're getting funded locally around the multiple states touching Louisiana. This is one that I'm aware of in Texas, at a small university. And so if you write a meritorious application, I think you're competitive and have a good shot at it. Hope that answers your question.
I have a question. Jennifer.
Yeah, one more question. Where is that?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Sorry,
when you review new R15 application, what criteria do you consider regarding the new applicant? Basically, how many publications or year of experience he should have before he submits R15? Means how many number of papers or something which you specifically want in that with that candidate, who is submitting his application?
There's certainly no NIH guidelines that you have to have 5 papers published or something. If you're asking, if you were a new investigator, you were a postdoc, you went to a school that meets the criteria for submitting an R15, I don't think you necessarily need any papers at your new university to write an R15. Now, presumably, you've taken a faculty position because you were a successful postdoc and you've met, appropriate training criteria to be given this faculty position. With that stated, I know that's generic, but you don't need 20 papers as a postdoc to be, able to submit an R15. There's not 10, there's not 5, but I think if you're a well-trained applicant, do fine. If you're asking how many papers published, if you have an R15 and you want to get renewed, in my experience, 1 or 2 was sufficient. Basically, they wanted 1. And it's 100. It's the equivalent of a 3-year. It's 3 years for 100,000, or 300,000 total, barely more than a single year of an R01. And most of us know if you are a brand new grant, you're not going to get much out in your first year. Different if you're an established investigator and it's an ongoing grant. But I think it'd be safe to say it'd be very difficult to get a lot of papers out. So I would worry less about that, and just making sure you're a good applicant, that the university is supportive of you, you have the equipment, et cetera, supplies to work on that, and certainly make sure, like I said, make sure you discuss impact to the university and so forth. But I don't think there's an absolute number as long as you've been a successful postdoc. Certainly if you published a paper as a faculty member at the new university, that's outstanding, and I think it'll be fine.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Thanks very much for staying with us. I know you have to leave to your next meeting, so we'll go on.
So if you guys need anything else, just email me. I do have the NIH. I know you can get it from the website. The R15 commentary says what's required. I can send that to you if you'd like it, that I got from the SRO. And if you do have any personal questions, email me, and I'll be happy to at least tell you my thoughts on it. So you guys have a good time. I'm off to biosafety now.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So we're going to switch gears a little bit here now and view the R15 from the other side, which is really from the people that have been awarded those type of grants. And based on certain time limitations, we're going to get Dr. Gissendanner from ULM to go first. And Chris has already an R15, and he's in the process of submitting, or maybe already has submitted his competitive application. So Chris, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks, Gus. So I'll just give you a little bit of history of my R15. So I got mine and started mine in the summer of 2009. So I'm finishing up my 3rd year. Going to go into 4th year with an extension. And I am in the process of planning. I haven't submitted my renewal yet, but I am in the process of planning it, trying to wrap up projects and so on, and hope to submit my renewal by either end of this year or the deadline in next February. But basically, one thing, when I got mine, I got it. It was a little bit different when I got mine. It recently changed. Mine was less money. It was $150,000 over 3 years direct cost. I had the 25-page limit and for the proposal, and also I was scored under the old system. So it was a little bit different when I put mine in. But I think even with the changes, I think the whole point of the R15 and what they're looking for funding are still the same. I'll just point out, just summarize a few things about my application, just sort of based on the reviews I got in terms of what they liked about it. Again, you've heard the emphasis on the science, and that is the most important thing. And so most of my reviews that I got on my grant, and I want to point out too that I actually took me 2 submissions to get mine. So I was able to take the first round of reviews and then incorporate that information into my second submission. But basically, most of the reviews on the grant that I got, the summary statements were focused on the actual research. I mean, that was most of what was in the summary statement. That is important, and that's what they're looking at first and foremost. Since it is a small time frame for a project and not a whole lot of money, at least relative to an R01, and also that you're doing the work at a smaller institution, obviously the scale of the project that you propose and the feasibility of being able to accomplish that project are going to be very big. So I made sure in mind that I had in addition to having a good hypothesis and working really hard on my specific aims to make those as good as possible, I really made an effort to try and make sure my proposal was really very focused I kept in mind that the work was going to be done by undergrads and master's students, and so I think that ended up going over pretty well. I didn't get any negative comments about the scale of the research I was proposing. My first submission, I did go overboard a little bit and got dinged on that, so I was able to take that into consideration on my next submission. The other thing I think that's very important with this, and you just heard about the importance of this just a second ago, is what is this? How is this grant going to impact your institution or your department and your students? So a lot of these applications come from undergraduate institutions, so they really are looking for how this is going to both involve undergraduates and impact the undergraduates at your institution. I really think that's important. In my application, I made it a point to actually discuss the times, what were the experiments that I was actually going to involve undergraduates in? What were some things that the undergraduates were actually going to do? So I actually specified that, undergraduates would be able to work on this project. It's something that could be done over the summer and so on and so forth. So it's not a training grant, but I certainly made it a point to talk about how undergraduates would be involved and even thinking about that in terms of specific types of experiments. And so that was something that was noted in my summary statements. Because when I did my first submission, when I didn't do that so well, I got dinged on that. So I was able to go into my second submission and be a little bit more specific about the undergrads. And really, I think that's really basically it. I mean, I think the two things to keep in mind are that you need to propose something that's good but also focused, and you need to keep in mind the undergraduates, the feasibility of doing the project at your institution. I think if you can cover those areas, then I think you're going to have a strong application. Somebody asked a question earlier about collaborators. I actually incorporated a colleague of mine from Tulane in my R15, and the way I incorporated it was as sort of a mentor-mentee sort of relationship. That I had this person who's a colleague and a mentor at this larger university who I could discuss the project with and get feedback on it. And so I didn't propose this person as a consultant, collaborator, wasn't paid, but just mentioned that I had somebody who I could discuss science with at a bigger institution. Whether or not that helped the proposal, I don't know, because it wasn't really noted in my summary statements. But I just thought I'd bring that up because there was a question about that. One last thing I think that's really, really important if you're writing an R15 for the first time, or any grant really for the first time, is to get somebody to read that proposal for you. I certainly did that, and it was extremely helpful because, for one, the person I got to read it was an R01 recipient, had reviewed grants, and so this person was able to take my proposal and really point out the weaknesses and the strengths and help me develop my specific aims and my hypothesis. So if you can find somebody with that kind of experience to send your grant to, somebody that will spend some time with it and be interested in helping you, I think that makes a huge difference in what you end up submitting.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Chris. So let's go ahead now and we have our final speaker, Dr. Shisheng Li. And Shisheng, we're happy that he just got an R15 award. And he's under the new guidelines, which is really the 12-page limit. And Shisheng, tell us basically the most important aspects of your application, how you put it together, and what do you think are the essential elements of your success?
Okay, I just got one funded this February. Fortunately, Jay actually helped me a lot because he had been on the review panel and told me what's the key points. So I didn't go through some other unnecessary struggles. Actually, this is the first submission and got funded. I was surprised. Basically, I got a copy, especially for the training part, what we should pay attention to. Jay gave me a few, samples. So basically, I modified based on what we have in the vet school. Then we incorporate this into the application. This part is in the research and other resources, facilities and other resources. What I incorporated in one, the student profile in LSU and in our web school, basically what the components of our students. That's one part, basically how many students, what they do, what kind of training opportunities for our students to receive, say basically some training grants and for undergraduates to spend the summer or spend some time in the lab to do their research. So basically tell them we basically pay attention to the undergraduate education. So that's one part. Another part is basically what I made for training graduates and undergraduate students. So basically how many students I trained in the years and what they end up with after their leaving of my lab, like that. So then basically how our school commit to research and to undergraduate students research too. So our web school generally, we have the LBRN system to train undergraduate students, and also have the Howard Hughes Medical Institute summer research scholars to spend the summer in the lab in our school. So we just say that. And also the last part is how this impact our basically infrastructure to our school, to LSU, and to the research community locally. I think this is a major part. But this part, the review comments, they didn't mention this. They mainly talked about the scientific part. So I don't know this training part contributed or not. Definitely should help. I don't know how much it contributed to, but I spent quite a lot of time on this. Fortunately, actually, Jay, as I said, helped me on this. Other part, the same question basically asked for Chris and the Dr. Andrew about the collaborators. Actually, I also have a collaborator who is in Cleveland, and her institute is not eligible. They are well funded. I also include her as a collaborator and also budgeted her 5% effort. So it seems to be okay. Don't need to be. I actually contacted the program director. They said, okay, don't worry if they are not a co-PI. If they are collaborator, you can budget them for salary. It's not a problem. I don't know if other institute or other program directors have different policy. I don't think that they have. They have quite uniform policies. It should be fine. I think include collaborators especially. They can do something we cannot do. That helped us a lot. So yeah, that's all I have. Mm-hmm. So if you have any questions, just.
So that's very good. I think we got a pretty good broad view of all the topics, and I want to thank first the reviewers for giving us a comment. So let's applaud them one more time. And I would just sort of very briefly summarize what I've heard and some of my own experience. So I think we heard from all the speakers that the application has to be scientifically sound. So you have to write an R1-like application. That is that the specific aims have to be clear, the approach has to be clear, and all of that. So the science is really preeminent, is number one. What we heard from Dr. Li just now was the fact that there are a lot of other things where you basically have to fill the spaces. That is your institution. What has your institution done in the past to support undergraduates? How many undergraduates are there? How they're supported? Is there a history of really training undergraduates? How undergraduates perhaps would be involved and how would they be accessed? Are there programs already in place that could rotate students, or you find students that come into your lab. And I suspect that what Dr. Lee mentioned is probably true, that you have to really do all those, but you may not necessarily review a critique of that, because the critique is on the science. But if you don't do those other points, your grant may not be reviewed appropriately, maybe even nixed, because you really do not qualify under the guidelines for really training undergraduate institutions. So I suspect it's very important, although it may not necessarily appear in a review. The issue about collaborations, I think my understanding of it, and as Dr. Yurochko also mentioned, it would be very critical that we don't put a senior principal investigator or co-principal investigator or co-investigator with sufficient time and money to do the work, because then that would be conflict. But if you had a collaborator, or perhaps even better, a consultant that would be willing to be working on some aspect of this with you, or perhaps even better, mentor you through the process, that appears to be a positive thing. So we shouldn't be afraid to link up with a major institution if it's really targeted and it's not really, we don't give them a lot of money, because this is really to fund the undergraduate institution. So if we have 95% of the money, or 90% of the money or more going to your lab at the PUI, at whatever the campus is, it's probably okay if you can justify the involvement of others. So I'll leave it at that then, and I'll open the floor now for general discussion. Any questions that you may have, we would like to address. And of course, this session is being digitally recorded, and it will be available to anybody else at later times to review them. And we will have the contact information for all 4 speakers that you may be able to contact later, and I'm sure all of them will be kind enough to respond to you. So any questions from the audience?
I have a question at ULM.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Can you please tell us where you're from and, your name, perhaps?
My name is Jennifer Whited, and I'm at UL Monroe. And I just have a question about qualitative research in these grants. Is that ever considered for R15s?
Quantitative.
Qualitative, more
qualitative. Descriptive. Anybody from the panel? Jay? Have you seen any qualitative?
I think the issue is that I think my first impression is that I think if you tell me that you are going to propose a qualitative research, I think I would like to get the meaning of it. If you could provide us some little bit more details about this.
So, I suspect, the criticism for grants in general, a descriptive adjective is a negative adjective. That is, if you really cannot focus on a specific hypothesis and propose aims to address the hypothesis, and you're really more in a descriptive way trying to deal with something, most likely my understanding is that this will not be particularly, good in terms of any application.
Typical methodologies for qualitative research, grounded theory, case study, phenomenology, are question-oriented, and they aren't necessarily hypothesis-driven. So I guess that answers the question.
Yeah. So, I think what you'll find is that there's probably some great variation among institutes. So if you're really targeting a specific aspect or a specific institute, the best thing to do, in my opinion, is to probably call the program officer, the SRO, and ask them specifically what you're thinking, tell them exactly what you're thinking, and how that would be viewed. Because you can get a lot of feedback before you even apply. You may even give them a little bit of an abstract of what you're thinking, and then they will give you some feedback and tell you, well, I don't know, this is not particularly good, or maybe a different institute could consider that. It is possible. Anything is possible. Even potentially writing a grant relating to more general other topics, mining, as actually Jay mentioned, data sets that are there that you need to mine in a new way or understand the world in a different way. So it is possible. I think what you're saying, it may be possible, but you need to really pursue the specifics with probably a program officer.
One other suggestion, just for more immediate information, could be just to search NIH grants that have been funded with some keywords that might be related to what you're doing, and see if there's been something similar to that funded. That way you can find out what institutes they're being funded at, and that might help you get some more information.
Thank you.
And that's a great suggestion with the NIH reporter. You can really track all grants that are funded. That will give you a view of the world in terms of what's funded, but also what is the competition and perhaps things to avoid so you don't go into an area where there are too many of those same grants. So,
Thank you.
any other questions? Anybody else?
Any other questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I had a question. Rachel, come. We can hear.
You guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Rachel,
I think a few of the speakers have talked about the impact on the students. Another aspect is the impact on the institution. Can someone, maybe be a little bit more specific about that impact? So it's mainly about building the infrastructure for research, or I'd like to get some comments on that.
I'll just say when I did my proposal, I did make note in my proposal that in my department at the time that I was the only one basically doing anything research that was, biomedically, relevant. And so at that time when I wrote my proposal, and I was in a different department at the time than I am now, but when I wrote that, I made sure to note that, that students who wanted to do biomedical research and they were biology majors, that there weren't that many opportunities. And so by getting this funding, it would open up opportunities for those students to get biomedical research experience. So I did utilize that information, and I'm sure it helped. In other words, if you think you fill some important void in your department by getting this project funded, maybe you're in some particular area of research that nobody else is doing in the area or something like that, you can make note of something there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anybody else from the audience? Yes, Eduardo.
Yes, given the small budget available for these types of grants, is it okay to request hiring a postdoc in an R15?
Jay?
I think probably you can do that. I think because, but the issue which is associated with this R15 mechanism is that I don't know whether you will have enough sufficient funds to hire a full-time or 100% postdoc. So since this is only $100,000, but I don't know whether that would be sufficient to hire a new postdoc. But that is the issue. But I think if you get the money, you can spend whichever way you would like to use.
Yeah. So that actually brings an important question. How much time, Dr. Li, have you put on your own time on the grant? How much time would be kosher to put on? Right. Whether it would be direct paid or cost-shared, to actually sound that you really have a significant amount of time on that. Because obviously, you can have an R1 and put 10% time and be okay, or 20, but on this particular grant, how much time did you put on it?
I put 1 month summer salary.
Just 1 month summer salary?
Yeah.
But what was the actual time? Did you cost share?
Percentage, that's about, say, less than 10%. Now about 10%.
So you only put summer salary, but you do not cost share any of your 9 months.
Right.
Okay, so that was sufficient then.
Right.
And they did not question that.
Yeah, they don't. Actually, they want the institution to support.
So that's what I'm saying, cost sharing. So I don't know if you're all familiar with the cost sharing mechanism, because you could be 50% time on a grant, but you can ask only for 10% of the salary, perhaps 1 month of salary. The other 40% is committed by the institution for your research project. So they could do that. So you could actually technically be 50% time, but I request only 10% of the money. And that sounds that you're really committed to this project, because it also looks like the institution is committing to help you, because it provides 40% of your salary to be committed on this particular grant.
I think probably we can ask Chris, but
Chris, what did you have in there? Did you have significant amount of your time?
My time was basically summertime.
Okay.
So I proposed summer salary and to spend the summer. I may have had 25% on mine or something like that.
Okay, okay. So I guess both of you had graduate students put in as a major budget item, or not?
Yes, yes. Actually, I didn't dare to put a postdoc there.
Yeah.
Because this grant, they emphasize graduate student and undergraduate training. Then postdoc is not considered as student training anymore.
Yeah. So they want you, I think, my understanding is that they want you to do the work with undergraduate students and graduate students.
Right. So postdoc one is too expensive for this kind of small grant. Right. And also this is not aimed at training postdocs. Right. So I think it's better not to put postdocs on.
I have an issue.
Yeah, Jim.
I think the other issue, I think a lot of people, when we reviewed grants, we got a lot of grants from research assistant professors. So I think what happened was, I think the committee members felt really that I think since for research assistant professors or instructors, I think although they are eligible, I think the committee did not support their grants. In other words, they dinged, all of those grants were dinged because I think they felt that I think these members did not have enough institutional support, and that was really sad. But that's what I have seen. So in other words, what they are looking for is that I think they look for some kind of an institutional kind of a commitment for you to train undergraduate students if you have an R15 mechanism or if you are going to have an R15 mechanism.
So part of the idea is I think it's possible you could fund it as a research assistant professor, but it has to be a substantial lettering of commitment from your department chair or your director or whatever, and to indicate that you're really on hard money as opposed to soft money, and there is commitment to your future development, perhaps. That may help in overcoming the fact that you're not really on a tenure track appointment.
And the other thing is also people usually do that. I think you may need to get a letter from your dean or the associate dean for research and people like that. I think that also may strengthen probably your application. So it basically shows, in addition to the letter from your department, that I think your institution is really committed for you to train undergraduates in this regard.
Anybody else from the audience? Xavier University, ULM?
No, LSU in Shreveport.
LSU Shreveport?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a follow-up question to that personnel question. So we here only have undergraduate. So let's say if I bring in someone from Health Science Center as a consultant or as a mentor type of thing, is it okay to maybe request salary for the graduate student over there in his group?
No, I don't think so. Jay, okay. What do you think?
I don't think that is the right mechanism. Yeah.
You cannot, the principle, the most important principle here is funding of the lab of the investigator where it is.
Right.
If any money goes somewhere else, it's probably a red flag. Whether it's for a graduate student or a PI, or you could access, one of the easiest things to access would be cost centers. So you could budget probably in your own budget that you can do certain samples sent to be, dealt with somewhere else as part of a cost center structure because you don't have it here. That's fine. So if you want to send a couple samples for mass spec in a core facility somewhere and you're going to get the data back, that's fine. You could budget in that. But you shouldn't be proposing any research aspect to be done somewhere else by somebody else.
Okay, thanks.
The other issue is that I think Chris may know that, and Shisheng Li is also knows that. I think if you look at the pay line from different institutions for R15s, so these are around between anything less than 2.5 at the worst. So in other words, these grants are people need to put up a really good grant in order to get that kind of a score of less than 25. So even if you look at the RO1 pay lines, we are funding around 10%, 10% of the grant. So probably the scores around 20 or even less. So even the R15s are around 25 or less. That depends on the institute. In other words, you shouldn't think that. I think even if you write a sloppy grant or if the kind of a grant, that will not have even a chance to be funded. In other words, your research is, I think, the core component is the research. It should be a really a solid, meritorious research. The second part is that I think earlier days, what they used to do is that they reviewed those grants, like Andrew mentioned, with the RO1 panels. So, but they came out with the conclusion that I think some of the reviewers may think that these R15 grants are also kind of an RO1 type of grants. So now the NH has decided basically to cluster those R15 grants. In other words, your R15 grants are competing against those R15 grants. So we will cluster them and we will use them separately. And also I am sitting on one of the R15F panels. So we usually, what we do is that I think we are trying to get all of those R15 grants together, and we are going to do it through the fellowship or the special emphasis panel type of study sections to avoid these issues with the other RO1 or R21 type of grants.
Yeah. And in other panels, I think Andrew mentioned that up in Shreveport, that R15s, even within the panel, will be reviewed as a batch. So they're not going to be reviewed, in between R21s or R1s. So they actually reviewed as a batch, if not in a separate section. But I think even NID, NIAD is moving now to a separate R15 panel. I wanted to ask the panel, and maybe Jay, you will know that, and it probably directed to you. Is there a geographical consideration? So if you have a lot of R15s and there are none of them going to Louisiana or Mississippi, is there a consideration based on where are they going?
No, I think basically, guys, I think that is a good question. But unfortunately, I think when we review these R15 grants, unfortunately, we don't even consider the geographic distribution at all. So, but I think we may consider, I think basically when we review grants, whether there is any diversity. So, for example, if you get a grant from the North Dakota State kind of university, or from the North Dakota Medical School, then I think there are a lot of American Indians are in there. So I think definitely, at least some people may consider that. I think we need to definitely encourage this underrepresented community, so that training them would be helpful for their successful careers. So in other words, in some places there will be a lot of the Latinos, and in some places there may be a lot of African Americans. So that the diversity plays some role, but I don't think that I think the geographic distribution plays any role in this process.
So I think obviously what Jay just mentioned, mentioning the presence of minority populations within a particular campus, access to minority undergraduate and graduate institutions, would be an attractive comment to make when you describe, the type of students that are available, obviously. So, anybody else? Eduardo, we'll take, I guess, a couple more questions and we'll conclude. Eduardo, go ahead.
Yes, so a little bit of background. I work with mouse embryonic stem cells, and so when I called the program director in my area, they wanted to see some functional studies. So I contacted a colleague in New Orleans, and he developed a mouse model of a disease. And the idea is to to send some students from my university, from Southern, and then spend 2 or 3 months in year 3 and do the animal experiments. And I want to know, you mentioned that the research has to be done in my university. Will this be allowed to send a student to do research in another university?
What do you think, Jay?
I think probably Chris may be better in shape. Chris, what do you think?
I really don't know. I mean, I think if it's Southern students, it's probably okay, would be my gut reaction to it, but I really don't know.
Yeah, the big issue, again, I think, from my interpretation of things is that you could, if those students are basically paid by your institution, Southern in this instance, they're going there and they're hosted, but you're not really paying that institution to do work there, it may be appropriate. But if you're actually budgeting time of the host institution investigator for them to do it, you have to be very careful there of what you're proposing and how major it is in comparison to your overall effort. So, I mean, you cannot probably propose to distribute half of your budget on your students doing work somewhere else, because that would be construed as actually doing it somewhere else. But if they're going there for a couple of weeks to learn and do certain things and bring it back to your home institution, that perhaps would be appropriate.
So will that mean that I will need to bring the animals to my lab to continue the work?
Well, yeah, if it's actually absolutely needed and they're going there to do it and there is some kind of a cost structure that you can pay for it and you can correctly justify it, it may be okay. As long as you're not paying people like, PhD level scientists to actually do it for you there. If you're saying that I'm going to go with my students and I'm going to house my animals there and the animals are costing so much, it'd probably be okay. But you just have to basically be careful that you really master of it, that you're doing it, they're just hosting you, and you're paying certain expenses that, like anybody else, accessing those mice or the cores or whatever.
I think that is a good comment, I think, from Gus. I think what you may need to do is that I think in your grant, you can, send anyone to anywhere to get the training which you think that would be helpful. That is okay. But at the same time, when you put up the application, so you should be very, very careful, like guys mentioned. I think you have to show that you are the PI, you are the one who is training the undergraduates. But I think some additional training, and in other words, put your collaborating institutions in little bit in a low profile in those applications. I think that is probably important because those institutions may not be eligible to get these even R15 applications. So in other words, the people from the small institutions, when they collaborate with big institutions, so you shouldn't highlight the big institutions because these grants are for small institutions. So you highlight yourself first and then you can put them as in such a way that they have a minimal role in your application.
Yeah. So the bottom line is, what is the impact to your home institution? Not to specifically only you, but how NIH helping you will impact your department, your institution, your college. And that's, I think, it's a very important consideration, because if you're saying, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do it in a medical center, and nothing really comes back to impact the home institution, it may not be necessarily appropriate. That's my understanding of it.
Yeah, the other issue is I think if you have time, I think because I wrote a letter, it's called Grants on the Run in Science, I think 2-3 years back. You can go and see that I think how at that time the grant situation was. At that time in 2008, I think, the grant situation was much better than now, 2009, than now. So every year the grant situation is, I have seen that getting worse. So in other words, what we all need to do is, I think, we have to try our best to put up a, really a solid application. Although it is an R15, there's a big difference between the R15s as well as RO1s. RO1s are kind of a 4-5 years, and it brings quite a lot of money than the R15. So in other words, for a nice R15, you may need to propose probably one hypothesis as always, two specific aims. Within each specific aim, probably two, at the most probably three experiments. That's all you would be able to accomplish using those undergraduates in your institutions. In other words, you have to be really realistic rather than overly ambitious, which I think the reviewers stated all the times.
So as part of the LBRN, we will probably be creating a core to help individual PIs with the write-ups and the review, and we'll be telling you how that's going to happen. And we're going to have additional sessions to discuss minority grants, AC1s through 3, as well as the R21 and R1 mechanisms in the future. So with that, I think I'll go ahead, unless there's some other burning question from the audience. Is there anybody else that would like to ask something? Then we'll go ahead and close the day session. Thank everybody for their attendance, and we thank the speakers again. And let's give one more round of applause. Thank you.